Okay, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know some more people might trickle in over the next, little bit, but we do record these and that will be provided to everyone who registered to attend. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for our webinar supporting adolescent survivors of sexual violence, which is presented as part of the National Center's Countdown to Portland, a National Training Institute webinar series. And if you could just go to the next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As I just mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and it will be provided to all registered attendees in the coming week. If you're having any technical issues, please feel free to use the chat to message Dashul Coleman or any member of the NCVC staff. Thirdly, we are unfortunately unable to provide attendance certificates and CEU credits for these webinars. Fourth, live captioning is available for those individuals who need it. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says show captions, and you should be able to click right on that to enable it. Lastly, we do ask that all questions be put in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box, just so we're able to keep track of it better for ourselves and our presenters. You should find that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as well. On my screen, it's right next to the show captions. It might show up differently on yours. We do ask that all questions be put in that box and they will be answered at the end of the webinar, which might run a little late because we are starting a little late, but we appreciate that. Next slide. I'll be really quick about this. We have our annual National Training Institute coming up in about a month in Portland, Oregon from September 18th to the 20th. We do highly recommend that you register and we hope we get to see a bunch of you there. If you have any questions, you can contact that National Training Institute at victimsofcrime.org email address. And lastly, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters, Carly and Anne. Thank you both so much. We're so excited to have you guys here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie. I am a Safe Harbor Navigator at an organization called Someplace Safe in West Central Minnesota.
And I'm Carly. I am a Safe Harbor Youth Advocate in Duluth, Minnesota.
Excellent. And today we are going to be talking about how we can better support youth who are involved in the criminal legal system. So really briefly, we've already gone over introduction, so we don't need to do any more time there. We'll talk about what it looks like to support adolescents. We'll share some information on how to better respond to disclosures of different types of victimization from young people. We'll talk about that initial report, investigation, and prosecution. And just as a heads up, we understand that folks are joining us from all over the United States, and there's going to be some differences, obviously federally and from state to state in this criminal legal response and how your court systems are run. But we're going to try to share as much information that's helpful throughout that process, regardless of location. So first of all, what does supporting teens look like? So what's really helpful in communication? Carly, go ahead.
That's okay. Also, I'll give the disclaimer as telling folks I am sick today, so I sound very nasally to me. I might not to other people, which is fine, but I might have to stop for some water and things throughout. So thank you for bearing with me. But like Annie started saying, what does supporting teens look like? What does communicating with them look like? Oftentimes when we think of somebody's like preferred method of communication, we think of what their first language is or what language they're more comfortable with. But when I think of this, I think of, is this a youth who is comfortable with us sitting and like facing each other and looking at each other and making a lot of eye contact and talking out loud? Or is this somebody who would prefer to write things down and then share those things with me by either, writing something down and then giving it to me or reading it off after they wrote it down? There might be different ways that folks feel more comfortable sharing information. And so as much as you can, how can you, honor and respect that and work around with whatever makes the youth feel the most comfortable? Wherever you're speaking with this youth, consider the space that you're in with them. So, this is a big thing that we think of why youth get interviewed at like child advocacy centers versus law enforcement agencies, right? The intentionality of that space, the neutrality, making it feel as comfortable as it can be in an uncomfortable situation, giving youth the option to have something to fidget with or draw. Sometimes they might want to do that, but they might not want to be the only person doing that. So I'll offer, like if you want to draw, you can doodle and I'll doodle. And then if who's ever in the room is also making them like kind of uncomfortable because they're staring and they're not really doing anything, then I'll offer, okay, you know, this law enforcement officer, they can doodle too. And like CPS we can all doodle at the same time. Things like that. What can we do to make them feel the most comfortable? Thinking about cultural, family, and societal considerations when we're talking to youth, especially when one of the reasons that Annie and I love doing these presentations around specifically teenagers is that teenagers are in such a unique age category where they look and talk like adults sometimes, right? But biologically, they're still kiddos. And so how do we navigate that kind of like in between? So keeping things in mind of, yes, somebody might be 15, but they might have been parentified for the last 5 to 8 years of their life. And so they might get frustrated if they feel that you're talking down to them, or you're talking to them like a, you know, like a 10-year-old or like a 15-year-old when they don't feel like a 15-year-old. So keeping in mind, what is this youth history? Where are they at, like in terms of, again, like that parentification or adultification at a young age? And then also keeping in mind like the language and the slang that changes all the time. I have no shame. I check Urban Dictionary probably at least once a day. But as much as I can when I'm working with youth, or especially in like group settings, I'll ask them like, what does that mean? Like, you know, can you tell me more about that? One, they think it's kind of funny because they're like, haha, you're old. But two, it gives a good opportunity to build rapport in that if they want to explain things to me because they want me to understand things, then I feel good about our relationship that they want me to understand what they're talking about, right? And then developmentally appropriate language. Again, sometimes this can be a little bit more difficult when we're talking to teens that look like and sound like adults and they interact like adults, and we forget that they are not adults. They are neurologically not adults, right? And so how do we make sure that we are using developmentally appropriate language without talking down to youth? We still want to make sure that we are engaging with them in a reciprocal and respectful way, and recognizing, again, that developmental stage, but also not talking down to them. Oh. Do you want to do this one, Anne?
I sure can. Yeah. So what does supporting teens look like in terms of transparency? Is we really want to be honest with them on outcomes, right? So there may be some things that we know that we don't have any control over, or there are some things that we do have say in, and we really want to be upfront and honest with them throughout that process. So again, if we can't make recommendations on placement or on different things, then we're not going to say that we can do that. Really just being honest and recognizing that young people often understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And they do appreciate being involved, and really having us share with them what we know, even if it is things that maybe we don't feel super comfortable with sharing with them, or maybe it's not good information. So really being transparent. We also really want to be providing them choices and opportunities for input. So for example, if there are decisions that are to be made, and we can't, again, make choices, what's the reasoning behind that, particularly when we're thinking about mandated reports? I do believe, and I know that we're probably not all advocates here, but to my knowledge, only Oregon has protected status for advocates, for those who are in the advocacy field in terms of mandated reporting. So the rest of us may be required to make mandated reports on things that young people share with us, and we really have no other options. So we really want to be sure that we're explaining that in full to them, and then also giving them options on when and where they want to be involved and who else they want to be involved and have share information. So I'm thinking about, depending on your state and depending on your agency, what are your legal obligations to involve parents, and what information can you share with them? So for example, in my organization, we have youth advocates, and the youth advocates do require a release of information from young people in order to share anything from parents, without parents giving a written request for documentation. We also will not share any information if there is an alleged abusing parent, so that parent does not have access to any information from young people, even if they do submit a written request. So really just knowing what those obligations are, and really honoring them, and really making sure that youth feel like they're being supported, and the information that they're sharing with us, and vice versa, is also not going to their parents really unless they want them to. Also looking at does the youth want to be contacted directly regarding the case, or do they want to designate someone else to be in contact for them? Maybe they want to have their parent be the number one go-to. Maybe they're in placement, they want their social worker or their foster parent to be that person getting that information. Maybe they want all of the information from law enforcement or from your attorney's office, county attorney, whatever that looks like in your area. Maybe they want that information going to the advocate who's serving them. So really just keeping in mind that this is something that a young person can and should be providing feedback on and really making those decisions. There are some considerations when we think about disclosures, again, recognizing that some of you today may not be mandated reporters and you may have protected or privileged status. For those of you who don't, we really want to remind you that many youth may have either ambivalent or even negative feelings about this child protection and law enforcement response. They may have had negative interactions themselves in the past. They may have seen negative interactions with their peers. They may have a family history, or there may be some community history there. So recognizing that while on our end, it may feel like something that is a positive thing, that young people may have the opposite feeling about that. They may be afraid. They may be really concerned about well-being. Maybe they've had reports made in the past and they've either ended poorly or they've ended in a good way. But those previous interactions can really impact youth's perceptions moving forward. For example, maybe it's a young person who's really fallen through the cracks before, or conversely, maybe it's a young person who there have been reports before and the result was that the young person didn't get removed and they maybe experienced further abuse. So just thinking about that, particularly around these disclosures, and also knowing that this is a situation where young people really don't have a lot of say or control, and that can be scary for them. So when we're reporting to either child protection or law enforcement, there may be both short-term and long-term negative impacts on their safety and well-being that we really know nothing about. So again, we're checking boxes, we're following laws as we're able to and as we're required to, but that's without recognizing that there could be some things that happen to these young people based on these reports that really have a profound impact on them outside of just placement, outside of just the interview process, that really have long-term impacts on them. Also, we really want to be keeping in mind crime victims' rights. So being aware of what your state's crime victims' rights guidelines are. Carly and I initially provided this training in Minnesota, and we outlined every single crime victim right. And it was maybe surprising, maybe not surprising, that there are advocates who are not aware of what they are, even within our state. So really being aware of what those rights are. Also looking at how our agencies and organizations adhere to those crime victims' rights. And then looking at how can you support young people in asserting their rights? And is there a difference in crime victims' rights in your state for victims that are children and victims that are adults? So really looking at that. And we're really interested in hearing, please share in the chat if your agency does address these concerns and issues and what that looks like for you. Also, just looking at that initial disclosure report. So now we're talking about what happens when a young person has experienced some form of victimization. What happens first, right? So we're assuming that this young person is reaching out to either advocacy, law enforcement, or another adult in their life, and they're making a disclosure, right? So something has happened to them that does require perhaps a mandated report. So how is that mandated report handled? In our state, a mandated report has to be made by the person who took that report. And what is, at least in my opinion, best practice is really allowing that young person to participate in that. So sharing with them, you know, as a mandated reporter, and this is something that I do. I don't do direct services anymore, but I do support groups, and I'm always sharing with young people every single time I'm working with them. I am a mandated reporter. These are the different things that I'm required by law to report. And I don't want you to feel like you're being pushed into a corner or put into a box. And if you want to share information with me that might result in a mandated report, there are some ways that we can talk about this. So we can talk about it like anonymously. So maybe you have a friend who's experienced something like this. But really being upfront with them so that they know beforehand, they're really not taken aback or surprised by this resulting from our conversation. And what I found personally, and this may differ from person to person, but I always tell people, you know, you don't have to share with me. You're not required to share with me your victimization. These are the things that I have to report. And I always have young people say, yeah, no, I still want to report this. I still want to talk to you about this. And then what I'll do from there is that in our state, we're required by law to submit both a written report and a verbal report. And so then I'll involve that young person in those reports as much as they're comfortable with, right? So I will say, hey, I have to call child protection, and I would really like it if you want to sit down with me while I make that phone call. So they can sit in the room with me, they can hear everything I'm saying, or conversely, they can also be on that call and share information and answer questions as well. And I'll also go with that process with the written report as well. So I'll write it up and I'll tell the young person, this is what I've written. Does this look accurate to what you've told me? In terms of school staff, really that depends on how things are handled, right? So I think particularly if a young person is experiencing victimization or has experienced it in the school or from a peer, that can lead to some different results. So just really being aware of what that looks like within the school, sharing information, who needs to know, why do they need to know, really looking at if anybody needs to know, it's really only for the safety of that young person. And then also looking at program staff, right? So what does that look like within your program? How are you educating people on the mandated report process and what that looks like? So then after we have that disclosure, we may also have a SANE exam, so sexual assault nurse examination, and we may also have a law enforcement report.
So, like Annie said, kind of before we jump into the law enforcement investigation, really keeping in mind how that report originated and recognize or trying to find out, if you don't already know, if this youth shared something and didn't realize it was going to be a mandated report and didn't know everything that was going to fall after that, like all the things that were going to happen after, or if they intentionally wanted to report and they wanted to share with somebody and they wanted this process to start, right? Because how somebody feels about this process going and what they wanted their involvement to be, it should absolutely adjust the way that you interact with them, right? So taking into consideration like how that initial report came out, and also just because it was a mandated report doesn't necessarily mean that they do or don't want something to move forward, but also it doesn't necessarily mean that they know that that mandated report happened, right? So when we're working in victim services and we have these conversations around best practices about mandated reporting, you know, giving choices when you can't give a lot of choices because you have to make that mandated report, but there's things around that that you can do, like offer that the youth is there when you make the mandated report, that they know exactly what you share with child protection, that you can help answer any questions, things like that. It's always possible that somebody shared something with somebody, a youth shared something with an adult, and then that adult made a mandated report and didn't tell them. And so that might change how that young person is looking at what's going on. So just keeping those in mind. As like a law enforcement investigation is beginning, letting youth know what type of information you can and cannot share with them during an open investigation. Some youth don't think that you can share anything. Some youth want to know every single thing that's going on, and you can't always share that either, right? Or law enforcement can't always. And so letting them know like what you can and cannot share throughout an investigation. And then throughout an investigation, what steps can you take to alleviate anxiety of reporting as well? So if law enforcement needs to reach out to this youth, do they want law enforcement to reach out directly, or do they want to go through a parent or a designated person that's more of a safe person for them? Where do they want to talk to law enforcement? Are they okay going up to the station, or would they rather be at their home or be at like a sexual assault agency's office, like different things like that, or at school, or they explicitly don't want to be at school? What parental involvement? So again, this goes back to what are your legal obligations to involve parents, and then also what parental involvement does the youth want? Sometimes we work with youth who have great relationships with their parents and they want their parents involved in a lot of things. Sometimes we work with youth whose parents are involved, but the youth doesn't want the parents involved, or I've had situations where parents are involved and then they are actively not sharing information with the youth. And then the youth wants to know what's going on in a case where they are the victim. And then so then we try to talk more about that, and it creates some issues between the youth and their parents, and then their parents and me, and right. And so how can we kind of like support those conversations, support the parents as well, referring them to services if that would be helpful for them to have their own advocate. But really knowing like how much you have to involve parents, and balancing that with how much youth want their parents involved. Um, And then notification of investigation updates. One thing that I really like that law enforcement officers in my area, I've seen them do, a lot of the investigators is they'll ask the youth, do you want me to text you like the day before, like the day of I go to make contact with this person? It really alleviates a lot of anxiety for the youth, so they're not just like wondering when that person is going to find out that there's an investigation going on, and wondering about if this person is going to reach out to them sometime in like the next week or 2 weeks or month, if they don't have that more tight timeline of when law enforcement is going to make contact with the offender. So that's something that I found is really helpful for youth is, can you just shoot them a text and let them know I'm going to talk to so-and-so today? It helps them a lot. It makes them feel more involved as well and makes them feel like they're getting more updates too. I keep forgetting Annie has the pointers. So moving into prosecution, kind of like this next step in reporting. Excuse me, my throat is so dry. If a case is referred and then they referred to, for us, it's county attorney. I know for other areas, it's maybe district attorney or different terms. So I'm just going to use county attorney because that's what it is for us, but you guys know what that looks like in your area. So first thinking about who should be there, who should be at the meeting. Again, thinking about parental involvement. If youth want the parents to be there, if you have direct contact with the youth, or if they know that the youth is working with somebody. So if say I sat with a youth for a law enforcement interview and then it goes to the county attorney's office, they'll probably know that that youth has been working with me then, right? So can you pull in those other players of support people to see who would be the most beneficial for the youth to have at that meeting, whether or not charges are going to come about. If somebody can't be at that meeting because they're involved in the case otherwise, so sometimes youth want their best friend to be there, but their best friend was around during the incident and they are going to have to testify, or they're going to be subpoenaed. And so explaining, why that person can't be in those certain meetings and not just leaving it at, well, it just has to be you or it has to be whatever, giving like a good explanation and like informing folks why things have to be a certain way. The next one. Oh. And then I realize I missed the last bullet on the last one, but explaining like who you are and then what your role is in the case and kind of like, what everyone is doing there. So like for us, oftentimes, if I'm at a meeting with our county attorney's office and a youth, it's usually the county attorney, their victim witness staff, the youth, sometimes a parent, and then me. And so they do a good job of explaining who's in the room, what everyone's role is, and kind of what we're all doing here. And so if you have that meeting and you are not able to charge something out, offering referrals to area resources and providing information regarding restraining orders. It's really important when we're talking about teenagers, especially under the age of 18, to know what what things look like in your state as to if minors can file a restraining order on their own or not. In Minnesota, they can't. Somebody who is 16 or 17 typically cannot file their own restraining order. Oh, someone said in California, youth 12 and older can file a restraint. That is amazing. Wow, that is so much more helpful than some other things. So, but in Minnesota, like youth don't technically have to have a parent or a guardian be the one file the restraining order. It can be like somebody who is like in a role model position for them, or somebody who is like very close to them who is an adult, but that should never be like, like their advocate at a center or things like that, just because of that relationship. Gosh, I'm feel like just brain soup today. But keeping that in mind, if you're offering a restraining order, but if their parents are not supportive, if they don't have a good relationship with their parents, if they're not really sure who actually would like file a restraining order for them, because the youth will have to fill out most of the restraining order or provide the information for that. But if it gets denied, if the ex parte gets denied, or they need to be at court for anything, whoever filed that restraining order for them needs to be able to commit to be able to go to court on behalf of it. And so when we're talking about especially at-risk youth who don't have a lot of strong, safe adult connections, this might be significantly more difficult and something to think about than just saying like, this is a great idea, like you should do that, and like not being transparent about what is actually going to be helpful versus what's not. And then refer to area advocacy services. So youth specific services as much as you can. Not all places have youth specific services, especially in like rural places, right? I work with kids across 4 counties because we just don't have the youth services in a lot of the smaller towns around here. And so referring to youth specific as much as you can, but if you can't, referring to whatever your area agencies are. And then if you are able to charge out, explaining the next steps in the process. The initial appearance, omnibus, these are terms that we use in Minnesota. Again, when Annie and I were kind of adjusting this to be a national webinar versus just Minnesota, we're like, oh my goodness, every state uses different terms for literally everything. So for us, we have an initial appearance, which is just that first hearing that sets the bail without conditions, bail with conditions, pretrial release conditions, things like that. They do not have to, defendants do not have to enter a plea at an initial appearance in Minnesota. A plea is entered at an omnibus hearing. We found out that in some states, those are all the same hearing. And so it's hard it's hard to have universal language when every state's legislation is so different. But depending on what the language you use in your state is, remember, unless there are like guidelines in your state or for your role that you have to use that specific language or those specific terms, try to explain in plain language as much as you can. I don't know a single 16-year-old that knows what an omnibus hearing is without having any sort of experience in the criminal system, right? And even if they do, they might not know what an omnibus hearing is. So making sure that even if you do have to use those specific terms, that you are explaining them in plain language. The system is very confusing for everyone, especially folks who have not had to be involved in the system. And we know it's not very user friendly, it's not very victim centered. And so doing what we can to make people feel like it's okay that they don't understand these things. I always tell people, I'm like, I don't expect anybody who doesn't work in the system to not to know what I'm talking, like what's going on with these, because it's very confusing. And doing things like that can really help folks also just feel like not stupid when they don't understand something, because it is really easy to like feel silly when you feel like everyone else in the room knows what's going on and you don't. And so making sure that we're reassuring folks that like, no, it's actually much more normal that you don't know how all this goes. Be clear, honest, and respectful in communicating if the charges do not match the victimization. So if somebody reports something that they think is going to be charged out as a sexual assault or something similar, and you have to charge it, it has to be charged as like a very low, like a 5th degree criminal sexual conduct in Minnesota for us is the lowest level of criminal sexual conduct. But they're confused because the sentencing guidelines look different, or they don't feel that that matches what happened to them. Explaining why somebody has to do that, why the county attorney's office or the prosecutor has to do that. We especially see this a lot with plea deals, right? Where the charges might be amended to still fit an element of the crime, but not fully match what that survivor has shared has happened. And so being as clear and honest and direct as you can about that. And then reminding folks of duty to disclose information to the defense. So there was a situation not too long ago in Minnesota that came up that really solidified that anything that victim witness staff who are employed at the county attorney's office, anything that they are told about that's relevant to, it doesn't even have to be relevant to the case. I think it just has to be anything shared from the survivor has to be disclosed to the defense. Previously, it was more so they leaned on if it was relevant to the case or not. There was a case where something wasn't shared because it was deemed not relevant to the case by the person who it was shared with. And then the defense came back and said, no, that actually was very relevant. And we should have had access to that information. And so now our prosecutor's office is doing a really good job at like setting those clear boundaries of if you tell me anything, I have to share with the defense. Now, in Minnesota, as a sexual assault advocate, we have special privilege that prevents us from being subpoenaed to testify in a criminal matter against our clients. And so it's really important at that time for us to discuss who's confidential and who's not, and what does that confidentiality and look like in different ways, because we're confidential, but we're still mandated reporters. And so knowing all those restrictions about your roles and the roles of the folks that you interact with. Somebody asked in the chat as well, will the recording slide deck be shared? Yes, it will.
Carly, I just wanted to add, so just for clarification for the audience, we do, at least in our state, and that might be different for other states, but we have victim service providers who are community-based, who are not embedded in their county response. So we also have victim services out of our counties as well. And so that's the differentiation. For community-based sexual assault advocates, they have privilege in communication with clients except for mandated reports, but those victim witness coordinators or victim witness providers that work within the county do not have that privilege. So that is, all of that information is shared. So just again, for clarification for folks who maybe aren't from Minnesota, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Okay, just getting some water. So then you have, there's the initial meeting with prosecution. And then kind of after that, what's the use level of expected level of involvement? So I've worked with folks who they think if they don't show up to every single court hearing, that the judge is going to think that they don't care about this case. And that's absolutely not true, right? We know that the majority of court hearings, I guess is, for us at least, they just get rescheduled anyway. There's not a lot going on at them. You know, we don't want to waste folks' time. Also, it's for how many court hearings have to happen for a court case, like that's a lot of time to have to take off of work and things like that. And so we know that, but folks who are not familiar with the criminal system don't know that, right? And so letting them know like what is their expected level of involvement. They can choose how involved they want to be up until, you know, a certain point. If we're talking about they have to testify. Also, what is your prosecutor's office policy on moving forward with a case that a youth does not want to testify? Right? And so being on the same page about that, communicating with the youth what their expected level of involvement is, how will ongoing information be communicated with the youth and who will be providing that. So same thing like when we're talking about with law enforcement investigation, does the youth want to be contacted directly or do they want to designate someone to be contacted for them? I had a client once that anytime that they saw the county attorney's number come up on their phone, it sent them into like a panic attack. And they were happy with the folks that they were working with at the county attorney's office. It wasn't that. It was just, it brought up so many things for them that they did not want to see their number show up on their phone. And so they said, hey, can you call my advocate and tell them? And then, you know, she can communicate with me. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. And that's a great workaround for making sure that information is getting to folks and that we're getting connected without, while still maintaining those supportive measures for folks. If the youth is interested in attending hearings, how can you talk to them about it? You know, we don't want to discourage folks from attending hearings if that's something that they really truly want to do. But again, you can have that conversation around, is it, you know, like maybe like why they want to attend, what they're looking to get out of that, and then also like explaining the different things around like what's going to happen at that hearing. I had a youth that went to a plea hearing and did not know that the defendant would be there. And so 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, she walked in and saw the defendant there and had no clue that that they were going to be there. And so things like that we don't always think of because we work in the system so much, making sure that folks are fully prepared as they can be. Somebody doesn't have an OFP or an HRO in place, and in Minnesota, these are our civil no contact orders, an order for protection and a harassment restraining order. These are not connected to the criminal matter. And so if there isn't a civil no contact order put in place, can you add a DANCO domestic abuse no contact order or a no contact order onto the criminal case? Oftentimes for youth, especially when youth don't have like a safe supportive adult in their life, and it might be harder to find somebody to file a restraining order for them, putting a no contact order on the criminal charges is way less stress for them because they don't have to do anything. It's the prosecutor asking for that. And then also, it's, you know, less work for them, but then there's still a no contact order. You can explain the difference between them, and, you know, sharing like, you know, this is only attached to the criminal charges, so this will go away if the case goes away, but being transparent with them. Also, it does just give them some time to get a civil order in place. Okay. I think in the interest of time, we should probably skip this one. Sorry, we started a little late with everything today, and so I want to make sure folks have time. Um, do you want to talk about plea deals, Anne?
I sure can. Yeah. So, how do you have conversations with young people about plea deals? So, you again, always in that honesty and upfrontness, is you're going to be going through the pros and cons of plea deals. What is the potential outcome, right? So, this is something that can happen. And what is the victim's right in regards to plea deals? Again, we know the victim's right change from state to state. And so, what are those rights in your state? In our state, our victims have the right to provide input. They can say that they think that it's okay for their alleged offender to enter this plea deal, or they can say that it's not okay, that they want to continue on with charges and that it's not okay to accept this plea deal. So they do have the ability to really provide that feedback and input on what happens here. And then also really looking at the sentencing and victim impact statement. So regardless of whether or not there is a plea deal or if a plea deal does happen, victims still have the ability to participate in really providing feedback on sentencing and what that will look like. And they also have the ability to issue a victim impact statement. So they can still provide to the court really the impact of the victimization on them and what they want to see out of this. And then they also are still eligible to receive restitution. And restitution is one term. Again, your state or community may use different language for that. In Minnesota, we're transitioning out of restitution into other language, so recognizing that may be the case where you're working as well. And then, Carly, do you want me to take this one as well, or how do you feel?
I can do this one.
Okay.
So working with youth to prepare them for a jury trial or a bench trial. Considering the many aspects of a trial that can impact a young victim. So oftentimes what we do is our county attorney's office will have folks like come in and look at an empty courtroom before they have to go in to testify anywhere, so that they know what the space looks like. They can sit in the chair and know exactly what they're going to see. We talk about what kind of fidgets they might be able to have. So I have like a box of fidget rings that I keep in my office for youth who have to testify. It looks like Annie might be holding some up too. For youth who have to testify, or even when they go into forensic interviews, things like that. I literally keep them in my work bag and hand them out like candy. Oftentimes that is just enough for youth to have something to do while they're talking, and it helps with their anxiety. Um, oh. um, And then preparing the youth for testifying in other ways, like letting them know what kind of questions the prosecutor is going to ask. You know, the prosecutor doesn't know exactly what the defense attorney is going to ask, but giving them some sort of ideas. Letting them know things like when it's the prosecution's witness, the prosecutor gets to ask their questions first, the defense gets to ask after, but then the prosecution gets kind of the last word, is what kind of like how we explain it. They get to ask the last questions to clarify anything. So if they feel thrown off by something the defense attorney asks, that, you know, they can feel a little bit better, and that the prosecutor can come back and ask a question to help them clarify their answer. Different things like that. Jury response to victimization. I don't know, I'm assuming most folks here have probably observed a jury trial. I am forever impressed at how much of a straight face juries can always keep, especially that these are typically folks that don't work in the system and are hearing things that they've probably never heard before. But that can be really unsettling to youth, especially, right? To see absolutely no reaction when they're telling a very emotional, traumatic experience. And so preparing them to, they are told to be neutral. They might have some sort of response, but they also might just look very like deadpan. It's not that they're not paying attention. It's not that they're not listening, that they don't feel for you. It's that they are trying to be as neutral as they can. And different things like that that can be difficult to explain. For youth too, is like reminding them, like, you want the system to work exactly as it should, so that we don't have to do this again. So sometimes youth might be frustrated at, they heard that their offender's defense attorney is a really good defense attorney. And sometimes like my reassurance is that, well, here's the thing, if they had a really bad defense attorney, they would probably get a mistrial, or we would probably have to go to trial all over again because they didn't have like adequate counsel and different things like that. And kind of like reframing that into like, you know, if this goes exactly like this person gets like the adequate representation that they need, and they don't have anything to argue about how everything went, and then they get found guilty, then we don't have to go through all this again. And so reminding them, some things with that. And then talking to them about conviction versus acquittal. This is something that especially comes up when we're talking about plea deals. A pro of a plea deal is that there's some sort of guaranteed accountability. A con is that it's not going to be as high. The sentence isn't going to be as high, or the charge might not be as high as a trial, but a trial is all or nothing. And so helping youth balance like what is most important to them for an outcome. Is it some sort of accountability, or is it having their data speak in court? And then using that to help them understand like what might the best route be for that case. And then sentencing. Man, I feel like we never mind. So sentencing, a pre-sentence investigation usually occurs. So like for us in Minnesota, again, I talk about the majority of my experiences. They do a pre-sentence investigation. Probation does. Part of that is probation is talking to the victim survivor and asking like what they want to see. How has this crime affected them? For almost every charge of criminal sexual conduct, there's going to be a psychosexual evaluation. And how do all of those things impact sentencing? And letting them, explaining to youth that they can provide that feedback to probation, but then they can also write a victim impact statement. They can also write that and submit it, and nobody has to read it in court. They can write it and read it in court themselves. They can have their advocate, they can have the prosecutor read it, like all these other options, right? So letting them know that there's not just like one straight shot of you have to write one and you have to read it in court out loud, because that sounds awful. And so letting them know that there are options for how they want this information to be delivered. And also that they don't have to be present for this hearing. Even if they want a victim impact statement to be written and read, they can write one and have somebody read it for them, and they don't have to be at that hearing at all if they don't want to, and that's totally fine. Yeah, I don't want to get too in the weeds about victim impact statements, but
Also, I will just say too, if you guys have questions, you can feel free to reach out and email us at any point in time. So Carly and I are always really happy actually to get into the weeds of things, but recognizing that we don't have a lot of time is like, maybe not today. So what happens if the perpetrator is a minor? And we know that due to juvenile protections that the majority of this process may not be public unless the juvenile is charged with a felony and is over the age of 16. And we do know that in most states, this is through Google, again, in Minnesota for sure, victim survivors still have the right to notices for hearings. They're allowed to participate however they choose to participate. They're allowed to protection, and they're also qualified or able to access restitution. So again, looking at what does that look like in your state, that's a part of the crime victim rights. And that's something that you can access again in your state through crime victim rights benefits, and that information is available there.
Sorry, I was peeking at the Q&A. We have a couple of really good questions in there that I'm excited to answer. So just some of the key takeaways from today. And again, we know we had a very short amount of time with folks. Annie and I both have ADHD and would love to sit and like, we could do this for 3 to 6 hours, probably just like sit and talk. And like Annie said, get into the weeds. So please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions. It was a very broad overview of different parts of the system that we can support folks in. And again, we love to get in the weeds. We just are doing much better at time management now, I will say. But some of the key takeaways from the things that we chatted about today is make sure that you're supporting youth in a way that they want you to support them, even if it's not the way that you think they should get support. Oftentimes, especially with teenagers, adults unintentionally have this idea that like we need to be a parent or a caregiver to them, and that we need to help steer them in the direction of making better decisions or things like that. The youth that we're working with in our jobs are not our kids, right? We don't need to establish that position of authority over them in any way other than we are a mandated reporter. Other than that, level out as much as you can. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're empowering them to feel confident in the decisions that they make for themselves and that they can advocate for themselves. And so, and in another way that helps build rapport and that they feel more like they can trust you if they feel like you're going to talk to them like a person and not like a parent, right? Every youth is different in their ability to understand and participate and navigate in the criminal justice system. Some youth want to be very involved. Some youth don't want to be very involved. There's no right or wrong way to handle a criminal case in which someone is the victim survivor in. And reiterating that to them, whatever they're looking to get out of that is totally fine. Again, not being unrealistic with what the options are, because we know that our system is not always the best. But not pushing them into things that they don't necessarily want to do, or not, not wanting them to do things because you don't think it's a great idea for them, right? There are a lot of unknowns and situations that can't be planned for throughout this process. One, I saw at the beginning of a question in chat of like when people have questions of they want to know all the things in the process moving forward. That can be such a slippery slope, because you start with one hearing, right? This is what happens at this hearing. Here's the 9 different things that could happen at that hearing, and the 9 different things that could happen at every one of those hearings, right? And so it's so easy to get in the weeds. And so a lot of what I do specifically with youth is we talk about next steps. What is a tangible next step? And then where do we go from there? If they want to ask specifically, is this going to be something that might come up? Like, will I have to testify at some point? Potentially, but if you do, it won't be for at least a few months. And I don't want you to spend months being anxious about something that hasn't happened yet and we don't even know that it's going to. And so how can you help recenter youth to the present while also helping them feel prepared as much as they can be for what the immediate next step is? Assess your role in this process and adjust accordingly. Again, what are your obligations for victims' rights, for notifications, for confidentiality, for parental involvement, different things like that. Know when you know, and then, well, I almost just said it, but in the same thing, know when you don't know something. Youth respect you a lot more as an adult when you present as somebody who is human, when you humanize yourself, right? And so absolutely saying, I don't have the best answer for that. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question, but let me help you find somebody who is. Make calls on their behalf. Like find somebody to answer that question, and acknowledging when you don't know something. Because one, again, that's building rapport in itself, showing youth that they can trust you because you're not just trying to always be right. While also like just protecting your peace too, right? It's a lot of like, there's things that are within our roles that we should be able to do, right? I can't do everything all the time for everyone. None of us can. And so acknowledging that too.
Carly, I just wanted to add to that too. As you were sharing everything on this slide, I kept thinking, and just as a reminder to everyone, that this is our job and this is the young people's lives, right? So the decisions that we make, really, we have to remember that it's impacting their lives and their futures versus just something that we do for pay. And not that any of us do our work for pay, right? Because we're all here for a myriad of wonderful reasons, but there's a difference in that this is what we think should happen, and what we've seen play out as professionals versus that this is my actual life. And sometimes youth need to make mistakes to learn from them, right? And sometimes youth need to participate as they choose to. We really don't want to take their agency away from them. So I would really like to, so we have some really good questions here. And I want Carly, both of us, to answer this first one: is how do you balance supporting them with what they want when they may not comprehend or know what they want or need because of the trauma impacting their cognitive decision making? I'll answer that, and Carly, you may have a different answer too. So I think the biggest thing is that so Carly and I both work for victim agencies, and our services are victim centered, right? So we really are, the work that we do is led by what the person that we work with wants, and we're really centering their wants and their needs, and their desire may not be what we think it should be, but we really want to be sure that we're centering their needs and really putting them in the driver's seat, and we're explaining things again to the best of their cognitive level, right, that depends on what their cognitive level is, but we still really want them to have ownership over their experience and how things play out.
Yeah, with this question specifically, I think what I think of more from like that systems lens is like, when a youth like does go through that initial reporting, and then the question is like, what do they want to see happen with that case, right? I find it extremely difficult to answer open-ended questions. And so, but we also don't want to always have a yes or no question, right? And so here are the different options of what could possibly happen. Which of these sounds like more in line with what you would like to see happen? So whether that's prison time, probation, treatment, things like that. Also, as much as you can, giving them time to like think about something. So you don't have to make a decision right now. We can talk more about it. A lot of times when I'm with youth in the prosecutor's office, the prosecutor will say, you know, you take some time and think about it if you want. You don't have to give me an answer today. And then me and that youth will meet separately, and then we'll have a space to kind of debrief and talk more about that, right? And so it might be giving them some more time, giving them some more space, having them connect with somebody who is like a support person, like being able to talk through, or just asking too, like like, you know, what concerns do you have? Is there anything that you can think that you would like to see? You know, kind of trying to get a little bit more in the weeds with them of like kind of what's going on in their brain, and then kind of assessing from there.
We have another really great question. Actually, two. I'm going to start with this first one because I think it's a really brief question or brief answer. Minnesota's involvement of canine therapy throughout the court process. I just shared that my agency doesn't. I actually don't know of any agencies in my region that utilize canine supports through the court process. Carly, do you guys? And again, I know that there are some that do, but I know that there's nobody here on this side of Minnesota that utilizes it.
I think there's like one place in Minnesota that does, and it is unfortunately not us. I
Yeah.
would love if we did.
Yeah.
We
That
do,
was
when kiddos come in for forensic interviews sometimes, if they bring like their emotional support animal, they can bring them in the room, which, well, generally, I think they're still letting them do that, because I know one time a cat purred in the microphone like the whole time, which was hilarious, but not super helpful.
okay. The next question is also really fantastic, and I have an answer, and I'd love for your answer as well because they may be different. Supporting children who are being groomed and you suspect molestation from a parent who's in law enforcement who seems to have systems on their side. How do you get them to open up in a safe way? So it sounds like this young person is connected with the support. And if that young person is connected with the support, I would just say it may take a significant period of time to build rapport and trust. And that's okay. So like I've worked with young people who are experiencing pretty significant violence, who had reported really significant violence in the past, and the reports were not, I guess the response to those reports was not the way that that young person wanted. And so that it took 8 months of meeting with that young person, 1 to 3 hours a week, every week, for them to really feel open to share their experiences with me. So, and that's somebody who did not have law enforcement as a parent. So just recognizing that it may take even longer for that young person to build trust with you. And then also utilizing kind of bigger support. So in Minnesota, we have something called the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. When there are concerns about how law enforcement is conducting their investigations, we can reach out to that bureau and say, hey, we have this going on. And they're almost, I wouldn't say a governing arm, but they kind of are providing oversight of smaller agencies' responses, and they can be a support too. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that would be my response. Carly, what do you got?
I think it would also depend on the age of the youth. So again, our lens is a lot more teen focused. And so if the youth is, depending on their age, if they want to like move out of the house too, or like be in like some other programming, that physical separation from that parent might provide them with more of the safety too to come forward. So like in our area, we have like programs that are self-referral programs. So it's not, they're not being taken out of the home from CPS or things like that. It's programs that youth can enter voluntarily. And so is there something like that that's an option to give them that physical degree of separation? Also, I think Annie mentioned when we talked about mandated reporting previously, if they don't want a report to be made, that might be a good situation to remind them that they can throw a hypothetical at you of what if somebody was going through something like this, or my friend that I'm not going to share their name, things like that. Sometimes it's hard because I know it kind of tears down the purpose of mandated reporting, but mandated reporting is not always the safest option for youth. And so we have to be considerate of that as well, and especially in a situation like that. So yeah, lots of rapport building, ways around mandated reporting if they want or are able to have that physical separation.
All of that is fantastic. There's a question in the chat too. Supports for parents and siblings. This in our state, it differs from agency to agency. So within my agency, we handle each individual in the family as a separate client. So we would have we have youth advocacy that's separate from our adult advocacy, and we would have separate youth advocates working with each of the children. We of course are always providing secondary support. So you may have a young person who's experienced victimization, and then their sibling is receiving secondary advocacy support from a separate youth advocate. And then their parent or caregiver is receiving support and services from an additional advocate. So making sure that everyone is kind of receiving services and support, whatever that looks like or whatever best fits that family's need. And again, that differs from agency to agency. So I know that Carly is currently the only youth advocate at her agency. So that response would look a little different there.
Correct. Yeah, I would just echo what Annie said. We're kind of our running joke at our agency is we go, everyone gets an advocate. So both parents can have separate advocates if they want. They can have the same advocate. Siblings can have advocates if they want. So everyone gets an advocate if they want. Sometimes this is really helpful, especially for parents who struggle with letting their kids meet with an advocate privately, or struggle with that. I'm not going to share with parents what youth share with me. Sometimes it's really helpful to reframe to them. It's really important that they have their own space too, and that this youth has their own space so that they can process separately with their own people, and then they can process together in whatever way is safest for them. And so sometimes getting parents their own advocate can also be really helpful in having parents support their kids in having their own advocate.
Carly and Amy, I just want to thank you both so much for your presentation today. It looks like so many people really enjoyed it. And we appreciate your patience and everyone else's patience with the tech issues in the beginning. I do want to reiterate one last time that we will be sending out both a recording of the webinar as well as the slides within the coming week. And with both of your permission, we will include your contact information in that email as well for individuals to reach out. We do have our National Training Institute coming up in less than a month. You can find out more information at victimsofcrime.org/NTI. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it.